The journey ended not with a gentle arrival, but with a violent lurch that threw Eleanor against the cracked leather of the stagecoach seat. For days, the world had been a monotonous blur of rolling plains and endless sky, the rhythm of the wheels a constant, numbing lullaby. Now, there was only a profound silence, broken by the tired snorting of the horses and the creak of the driver setting the brake. Dust, fine as powdered bone, settled over everything. Peering through the grimy window, Eleanor saw nothing. Not a town, not a welcoming light, just an immense, gray canvas where the sky bled into the earth. This was it, the end of the line, the beginning of a life she had purchased with the last of her dignity. With bones that ached from the relentless travel, she gathered the small bundle that held all her worldly possessions and pushed open the stiff door. The wind hit her first, a raw, scouring force that tore at the loose strands of her hair and pressed the fabric of her old wedding dress against her legs. It was a dress that had seen one failed ceremony already, a relic of a life she'd fled. It felt foolishly out of place here, its worn lace a mockery in the face of such desolation. A man stood waiting beside a rickety buckboard. Samuel. His name was the only solid thing she had to cling to. He was taller than his letters suggested, broader in the shoulder, and carved from the same unforgiving landscape as his ranch. His face was a map of hard sun and harder years, his eyes the color of a winter sky, holding no warmth or welcome. He didn't step forward to help her down. He simply watched, his gaze flat and impersonal, as if assessing a new piece of livestock. "You're Eleanor," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she managed, her voice a dry whisper. "Mr. Croft." He gave a curt nod, his jaw tight. "Get in the wagon." The ride to the ranch was conducted in a silence as vast and empty as the land around them. Eleanor clutched her bundle, stealing glances at the man beside her. He held the reins with a practiced ease, his knuckles scarred and calloused. He seemed a part of this place, weathered, silent, and enduring. He didn't ask about her journey. He didn't speak of their future, the contract they had signed, the letters they had exchanged. Brief, practical things, felt like a fiction from another world. Here, the only reality was the wind, the cracked earth, and the crushing weight of the man's indifference. The ranch, when it finally came into view, was a fresh shock to her system. It was less a home and more a scar on the land. A small, bleak cabin stood hunched against the wind, its tin roof streaked with rust. A dilapidated barn sagged nearby, and a few lonely fence posts marched off into the emptiness before giving up. Crows circled overhead, their harsh cries the only music in this barren theater. The soil in the small yard was split with deep fissures, as if the very ground was crying out from thirst. There were no flowers, no trees, no sign of a gentle hand, only survival. Samuel pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down. "This is it," he gestured vaguely toward the cabin. "Your room is to the left, kitchen's through there, outhouse is out back. I'll take the horses." And with that, he was gone, leading the team toward the barn, leaving her standing alone in the dying light. The loneliness was a physical blow, more potent and terrifying than anything she had ever known. Back in Boston, she had been invisible in a crowd. Here, her solitude was amplified by the sheer scale of the emptiness. She took a deep breath, the air thin and cold, and forced her legs to move. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled of wood smoke, dust, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of sorrow. It was clean, but starkly so. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a cold hearth, and a few bare shelves constituted the main room, as promised. A door to the left led to a small, cell-like room with a narrow cot and a single window that looked out onto nothing. There was no pretense of a shared life, no illusion of a marriage. This was an arrangement, a transaction. He needed a woman to run his house. She needed a place to disappear. Despite the cold reception and the desolation that threatened to swallow her whole, Eleanor did not allow herself to crumble. She had not survived this long to be broken by a silent man and an empty patch of dirt. The next morning, she rose before the sun, her movements quiet and deliberate. She found the meager stores, flour, beans, salted pork, and set about making a breakfast she wasn't sure he would even eat. She swept the floors, dusted the shelves, and scrubbed the soot from the small stove until her knuckles were raw. She worked with a grim determination, imposing order on the small space as a defense against the chaos of her own heart. When Samuel came in from his morning chores, he stopped in the doorway, a flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossing his features before the mask of indifference fell back into place. He saw the plate of biscuits and gravy on the table, the pot of coffee simmering on the stove. He said nothing. He simply sat, ate quickly, and left, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. Their days fell into a harsh, unspoken rhythm. He would be gone before she woke, his cot already cold, and he would return long after the sun had set, his face grimy with sweat and dirt. He worked his land with a ferocity that seemed born of rage, as if he were trying to beat the earth into submission. He avoided her gaze, skirted around her in the tight confines of the cabin, and never spoke a word that wasn't a direct necessity. Pass the salt. More coffee. The bay mare needs shoeing. At night, the separation was absolute. He retired to the small room that was clearly his own, the door closing with a soft, final click. She lay on her narrow cot, listening to the wind howl and the house settle, feeling the chill of the sheets seep into her bones. She was a ghost in this house, a mail-order bride to a man who was married to a memory. The truth of his past came to her not from him, but in fragments from their nearest neighbor, a woman named Martha, whose homestead was a 2-hour ride away. Eleanor had gone to trade some of her mending skills for a few precious eggs. Martha was a kind woman, her face a web of wrinkles, her eyes full of a pity that Eleanor found unnerving. "It's hard on a man, losing a wife out here," Martha had said, her voice low as she inspected Eleanor's stitching. "Especially the way he lost Sarah." Sarah. The name landed like a stone in Eleanor's stomach. "An accident, they called it," Martha continued, not meeting her eyes. "A wagon wheel broke on the ridge road. Threw her clear, broke her neck. Samuel was driving." The woman paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "He hasn't been right since. Some folks, they have a dark cloud over them. Folks around here whisper he's an ill-fated man. That trouble follows him. I don't hold with such talk, but you be careful, child." The words haunted Eleanor on the long ride back. An ill-fated man. It explained the wall he had built around himself, the coldness that was not just indifference but a deep, impenetrable shield. He wasn't just grieving. He was being judged. He was living in a prison of his own loss and the town's suspicion. One night, the sound shattered the cabin's oppressive silence. It was a guttural cry, ripped from a place of unimaginable pain. Eleanor sat bolt upright in her cot, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound came again, from his room. It wasn't a shout of anger, but a sob of pure, unadulterated agony. And then, a name, choked out from the depths of a nightmare. "Sarah!" Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling her own gasp. She pictured him in there, alone in the dark, the stoic, silent rancher completely undone by his dreams. He was not a monster. He was a man drowning in a sea of grief she could never comprehend, in the darkness of her own room. Listening to the muffled sounds of his sorrow, Eleanor wept. She cried for his lost wife, for the weight of guilt he carried, and for the hopeless, unbridgeable distance that lay between them. The next day, he was even more remote, his eyes hollowed out, the lines around his mouth etched deeper. He could not know that she had heard, that she had been a witness to his unraveling. But his defenses were higher than ever. The isolation began to feel like a disease, eating away at her sanity. To keep from screaming, to keep from simply walking out into the plains and letting the wilderness claim her, she began to write. She had a small, leather-bound journal she'd kept hidden at the bottom of her bundle, by the flickering light of an oil lamp. Long after he had shut his door, she poured her heart onto the pages. The paper was her only confidant, the ink her only friend. October 12th, she wrote, her hand cramping from the cold. The wind has not stopped for 3 days. It speaks a language of utter despair. I feel my own voice has been stolen by it. Today, I found a small, withered flower pressed between the pages of a book on his shelf. I imagine it was hers. His silence is not empty. It is full of her. I wonder if he looks at me and only sees the woman who is not Sarah. I do not know which is worse, to be hated or to not be seen at all. I sometimes feel a strange pity for him, this man who is my husband in name only. We are two ghosts rattling around in a house that is too small for our combined loneliness. The silence of their arrangement was shattered not by a word, but by the absence of one. Samuel was late. The sun had long bled out across the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised purple, and the stew she'd prepared was growing cold on the stove. A knot of unease tightened in Eleanor's stomach. In all the weeks of his rigid, punishing schedule, he had never once deviated. His predictability was the one constant she could rely on in this desolate world. Tying a worn shawl around her shoulders against the encroaching chill, she lit a lantern and stepped out into the vast, whispering darkness. The wind carried the scent of dust and distant cattle. "Samuel?" she called, her voice thin and immediately snatched away by the immensity of the plains. She found him near a rocky outcrop at the edge of the west pasture. He was on the ground, leaning heavily against a boulder, his face pale and slick with sweat in the lantern's glow. One leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and the dark stain of blood was spreading ominously down his denim trousers. A half-wild steer, its eyes still crazed, snorted and stamped in the distance before finally thundering off into the night. "Don't!" he growled as she rushed to his side, his voice a low rasp of pain and fury. The word was a shield, an instinct to ward off the very help he so clearly needed. Eleanor ignored him. The sight of his vulnerability stripped away the weeks of fear and intimidation. Here, he was not the cold, unapproachable master of the ranch. He was simply a man, broken and bleeding on his own land. "Don't be a fool," she said, her tone sharper than she intended. She knelt, lifting the lantern to inspect the wound. A deep, wicked gash ran the length of his calf, torn open by a horn or a sharp rock. It was bleeding freely. Getting him back to the cabin was an ordeal. He leaned on her, his arm heavy and tense around her shoulders, his breathing ragged with every agonizing step. The sheer, solid weight of him, the scent of his sweat and the earth, was an intimacy more profound than any they had shared. He fought his reliance on her the entire way, his pride a palpable, bitter force between them. Inside, by the warmth of the stove, she eased him into a chair. She brought whiskey, clean rags, and the needle and thread she used for mending clothes. He watched her every move, his jaw set like granite, his eyes narrowed with a mixture of pain and suspicion. "I can do it myself," he muttered, reaching for the bottle. "And make a mess of it?" she countered, gently pushing his hand away. "Hold still." She worked with a quiet, focused competence. She poured the raw whiskey over the wound, and though he flinched, a muscle jumping in his jaw, he made no sound. Her hands, when she began to clean the gash, were trembling slightly, but her touch was firm. She was all business, her face illuminated by the oil lamp, her brow furrowed in concentration, as she drew the needle through his skin, stitching the torn flesh back together with small, even sutures. The silence in the room began to change. It was no longer a void, but a space filled with the quiet sounds of her care. the dip of a rag in water, the snip of thread, their shared breathing. Samuel watched her hands. He had only ever seen them scrubbing pots, kneading dough, or gripping the reins of the wagon. Practical, capable things. Now, they were bringing him a strange and unwelcome comfort. The tremor in them didn't speak of weakness, but of a profound empathy that unnerved him. "You've done this before," he said, the words rough from disuse. She didn't look up from her work. "You learn to do what's necessary." She tied off the last stitch and began to wrap the leg in clean strips of linen. His gaze softened. The hard, protective shell of his grief cracking just enough to let a sliver of light in. For the first time, he saw not just the mail-order bride he had acquired, but the woman who was patiently mending him. "My father, he was a soldier," Samuel said, his voice quiet. He spoke to the flickering lamp as much as to her. "Came back from the war with fewer friends and more ghosts. Taught me that pain is just a thing to be ignored. Said it was a man's lot." Eleanor paused, her hand still on his bandaged leg. She finally met his eyes. "My father taught me that a daughter was a commodity, a debt to be settled." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and terrible. She saw a question in his eyes, an invitation to say more. "I was to be married to a man in Baltimore, a business associate of his. He was 30 years my senior." She took a breath, the memory still sharp and cold. "My father called it a good match. I called it a cage. So, one night, I took what little I had and I ran." She said no more. She didn't need to speak of the fear, the desperation, the shame of becoming a woman for sale in a different way, through a catalog, hoping for a stranger who was merely cold instead of cruel. He heard it all in her silence. He saw the shadow of that cage in the proud, defiant set of her jaw. In that moment, he understood that she, too, was a veteran of a different kind of war. Later, as the cabin settled into a deep quiet, they sat at the table. The rain that had been threatening all evening began to fall, a soft, persistent drumming on the tin roof. The sound insulated them, creating a small haven in the vast, dark world. Samuel stared at her hands, which were resting on the wooden tabletop. They were red and chapped from lye soap and hard work. He cleared his throat. "Your hands," he began, his voice hesitant, clumsy. "They don't belong in this dirt." He looked from her hands to her eyes, his own gaze raw and unguarded. "They belong on my chest." The air crackled. The statement was so unexpected, so intensely personal. It left her breathless. Before she could process it, he leaned across the small table, his face closing the distance that had defined their lives for weeks. He captured her mouth with his own. The kiss was not gentle. It was a collision of hunger and loneliness, a desperate, frantic thing. It was the taste of whiskey and rain, of unspoken grief and unfulfilled longing. Her hands, the ones he had just praised, came up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer. His arms went around her, lifting her from her chair as if she weighed nothing. And everything they had held back, the anger, the sorrow, the searing need to feel something other than pain, poured out into that single, violent point of contact. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the world clean. Inside, a fire they had both thought long dead roared to life, and in its heat, Eleanor felt as if she were being born again. The morning broke gray and washed out. Eleanor woke on her cot, the memory of the night a warm, vibrant thing inside her. She rose, her body humming with a new and unfamiliar hope, and went to the main room, expecting to see, she wasn't sure what, a change, a smile, something. Instead, she found Samuel standing by the hearth, his back to her. He was already dressed, his injured legs stiff. He turned as she entered, and the hope in her chest shriveled and died. The wall was back, higher and more formidable than ever. The vulnerability of the night was gone, replaced by a harsh, defensive scowl. The warmth in his eyes had been extinguished. leaving only cold, gray ash. "The coffee's on," he grunted, not looking at her. He moved stiffly toward the door. "Samuel, wait," she said, her voice small. He paused, his hand on the latch, but did not turn. "Got work to do?" "Your leg?" "It's fine." "Last night," she started, but the word caught in her throat. "Last night was a mistake," he said, his voice flat and brutal. "A moment of weakness. It won't happen again." He opened the door and limped out into the muddy yard without a backward glance, leaving her alone with the echoes of his cruelty. The pain was sharper and deeper than his initial indifference had ever been. That had been the coldness of a stranger. This was a personal rejection, a denial of the connection she had felt so powerfully. He had opened a door inside her, only to slam it shut in her face. Tears of hot, bitter anger welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not be a victim in his house. She would not wait for him to deem her worthy of a kind word. Her father had tried to make her powerless, and she had run. This man would not succeed where he had failed. With a quiet, resolute fury, she went to her room and gathered her meager belonging. She took the spare blanket from her cot and her journal. She marched out of the cabin, past the kitchen where the scent of coffee still hung in the air like a broken promise, and went straight to the barn. The air inside was warm and thick with the smell of hay and horses. In an empty stall, clean and dry, she laid out her blanket. This would be her space, a place where his moods and his ghosts could not touch her. It was a declaration of independence. She would still cook and clean. She was not a woman to shirk her duties, but she would no longer share his roof or his table. That evening, when he came inside, weary and caked in mud, he found his dinner on the table, covered to keep it warm, but the second chair was empty. He looked around, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He called her name. Once. The only answer was the drumming of the rain and the profound silence of the empty cabin. He was alone again, just as he had always wanted to be. But for the first time, it didn't feel like peace. It felt like a punishment. Weeks passed in a state of armed truce. Eleanor kept to her self-imposed exile in the barn, creating a small, defiant pocket of existence for herself. She took her meals alone, finding a strange solace in the quiet company of the horses. Samuel left her food on a crate by the barn door, a silent, daily acknowledgement of the chasm he had opened between them. The cabin, once a shared space of cold silence, was now solely his domain, and from what little she could see, it felt emptier than ever. The rejection still stung, a dull ache beneath her ribs, but it was being slowly replaced by a resolute, hardening pride. The catalyst for change came not from within the isolated borders of the ranch, but from the dusty, gossiping heart of the nearest town. Samuel had ridden in for supplies, his injured leg now a dull throb rather than a sharp agony. While waiting for the mercantile owner to weigh out a sack of flour, a man he didn't recognize entered. He was dressed in city clothes, a tailored coat and polished boots that were an affront to the mud and manure of the street. He moved with an air of smug authority, his eyes sweeping over the room's occupants with dismissive appraisal. The stranger approached the counter, his voice smooth and cultured. "I'm looking for someone," he announced, his tone suggesting it was the town's duty to assist him. "A young woman, came out west a few months ago. Answers to the name Eleanor. My runaway bride." Samuel froze, his back to the man, his hand hovering over a barrel of nails. A cold dread, heavy and metallic, settled in his gut. The store owner, a portly man named Jed, grunted non-committally. "Lots of folks come and go." "This one is special," the stranger said, a smirk in his voice. He produced a small, silver daguerreotype from his coat pocket and slid it onto the counter. "Fair hair, blue eyes, quite lovely, though more stubborn than is good for her." From the corner of his eye, Samuel saw Jed pick up the photograph. He heard the man's sharp intake of breath. He knew, with a certainty that made him sick, whose face was captured in that silver frame. It would be a younger Eleanor, one whose eyes had not yet been shadowed by hardship and a cross-country journey to nowhere. Jed slid the picture back across the counter. "Don't know her." The lie was flat and unconvincing. Folks in this part of the country were wary of city men asking after runaway women. It was rarely for a happy reunion. The stranger's smile tightened. "A reward is offered for information. A substantial one." He let the words hang in the air before retrieving his photograph and turning to leave. As he passed Samuel, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. The stranger's gaze was cold and possessive. Samuel's was like flint. The ride home was a torment. The man's words echoed in his mind. My runaway bride, he had taken Eleanor for a survivor, a woman escaping a loveless, arranged future. But what if she was something else entirely? A liar? A thief who had broken a legal, binding contract? His own past, stained by the town's suspicions about Sarah's death, made him paranoid. He knew how quickly people judged, how easily a story could be twisted. He saw the stranger's polished boots and imagined the law on his side. He said nothing to Eleanor when he returned. He couldn't. The suspicion was a poison, clouding his thoughts, turning the fragile empathy he'd felt for her into a curdled, wary resentment. He started watching her. As she fed the chickens or mended a fence line, he would observe from a distance. His eyes narrowed, searching for the lie in her movements, the deceit in the quiet set of her shoulders. And at night, for the first time since she'd arrived, he began to slide the heavy iron bolt on the cabin door. It was a loud, definitive sound in the prairie silence, a sound that declared the house a fortress, a sound that declared her, in the barn, an outsider, a prisoner. Eleanor felt the change instantly. It was more chilling than his angry rejection had been. The rage had been hot and alive. This was a cold, creeping dread. She felt his eyes on her during the day, a heavy, speculative gaze that made the hair on her arms stand up. It was a look she knew all too well. It was the look of a man assessing his property. It was the look that had made her run from Baltimore in the first place. The sound of the bolt sliding home on that first night sent a shock of pure terror through her. The barn, which had been her sanctuary, suddenly felt like the cage it was. She was trapped on this isolated ranch with a man who now looked at her as if she were a viper he'd foolishly taken in. The old fear, the suffocating panic she thought she had left 1,000 miles behind her, came rushing back. She spent the night huddled in her blanket, listening to the coyotes cry, feeling the walls of her past closing in. She could not live like this. After 3 days of his silent surveillance and 3 nights of the bolt sealing her fate, she knew she had to face him. To run again was to die. To stay silent was to let the fear consume her. She waited until a full moon had risen, bathing the desolate landscape in a ghostly silver light. She walked from the barn to the cabin and knocked on the door he had locked against her. After a long moment, she heard the bolt scrape back. He opened the door a crack, his face a hard mask in the shadows. "I need to speak with you," she said, her voice shaking but firm. He stared at her, then stepped back, letting her enter. The air inside was thick with tension. "He was here, wasn't he?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The man from Baltimore. You saw him in town." Samuel's stony expression was all the confirmation she needed. "He says you're his wife." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "I was his purchase. There is a difference." She stood in the center of the room, hugging her arms around herself. A lone, fragile figure. "You look at me, and you see a liar. You lock the door because you are afraid of what I am. You have every right to know. You have a right to know who is sleeping in your barn." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "His name is Alistair Finch. My father owed him a great deal of money. I was the final payment. I tried to be compliant. I tried to be the dutiful bride he had bought, but his house was a prison. Samuel, a beautiful one, with silk curtains and polished floors. but a prison all the same." Her voice dropped, raw with the memory. He never raised his voice. He never had to. His displeasure was in his eyes, in the way he would lock a door behind me, in the way his touch was not a caress, but a brand of ownership. She finally looked at him, her own eyes swimming with unshed tears. He did not beat me with his fists. He beat me with silence, with isolation, with the knowledge that I was utterly, completely his property, to do with as he pleased. She faltered, the next words the hardest of all. And when I would not yield to him willingly, he would take what was never his to give. He believed that the contract my father signed gave him the right to my body, whether my soul consented or not. The confession, the ugly, final truth of it, hung in the air, seeming to suck all the oxygen from the room. Samuel stood as if turned to stone. The foundation of his suspicion, of his righteous anger, crumbled into dust. He saw not a runaway bride, but a caged animal who had gnawed through her own leg to get free. He saw the terror she had lived with, and the fresh hell of it he had unknowingly resurrected with his watching eyes and his iron bolt. An immense, crushing wave of shame washed over him. In 2 long strides, he crossed the room. He didn't stop to think. He simply reached for her, pulling her into an embrace so fierce it threatened to break her. He buried his face in her hair, his body trembling with a violent, uncontrollable shudder. "Eleanor," he choked out, her name a prayer of apology. And then, for the first time in years, Samuel Croft wept. He cried for her, for the horrors she had endured alone. He cried for his dead wife, Sarah, and the grief he had never been able to voice. He cried for the fool he had been, hiding behind his own pain while she suffered in silence just yards away. Feeling his body shake against hers, the dam of Eleanor's own control finally broke. She clung to him, her sobs tearing from her throat, and they stood there in the middle of the dark cabin, 2 broken people holding each other together as they finally, completely, fell apart. Later, when the tears had subsided, leaving them exhausted and raw, he led her to his room, not to the narrow cot she had used, but to his own bed. There was no fire of passion like before. This was something else entirely. It was a quiet, solemn act of healing. He undressed her slowly, his calloused hands reverent on her skin, as if tending to a sacred wound. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the imperfections or the scars, but the breathtaking strength of her survival. Their coming together was a slow, tender exploration, a silent conversation in a language of touch. It was a reclaiming of intimacy, an affirmation of life in the face of so much death and despair. It was as raw and real and stripped bare as their confessions had been. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the sheets, the moonlight tracing a silver path across the floor, Eleanor whispered into the darkness. "I am not a maiden," she said, the words heavy with a lifetime of shame. "I am not perfect." Samuel gathered her closer, his lips brushing against her temple. He felt the steady beat of her heart against his chest, a rhythm of resilience, of life stubbornly persisting. "You're alive," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "That's enough." For a few short, sun-drenched weeks, the ranch was no longer a place of survival, but a home. The silence that had once been a weapon between them became a comfortable language of shared glances and knowing smiles. Laughter, a sound so foreign it was startling at first, began to echo in the small cabin. Eleanor planted a small garden of hardy herbs near the door, a stubborn patch of green in the relentless brown. Samuel, in turn, fixed the sagging porch step and planed the rough edges from the kitchen table until it was smooth beneath her hands. The ghosts that had haunted the corners of their lives seemed to recede, banished by the simple, powerful light of their newfound happiness. They were a man and a woman building a life, not from a contract, but from the salvaged pieces of their broken hearts. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday. The sky was a vast, cloudless blue, and the air was warm with the promise of a gentle autumn. Eleanor was hanging laundry on the line, the white sheets brilliant against the sky, when she saw the buggy approaching. It was too sleek, too polished for this part of the country. Her hands stilled, a wet pillowcase dripping forgotten onto the dusty ground. A cold, familiar dread began to crawl up her spine. Samuel came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, a question in his eyes. He saw the direction of her terrified gaze, and his body went rigid. The buggy pulled to a halt, and the man who stepped out was the one from Samuel's memory in town, Alistair Finch. He was immaculate, his city clothes untouched by the dust of the road. He moved with an unhurried, proprietary air, his eyes fixing on Eleanor not with affection, but with the cold appraisal of a man reclaiming a lost possession. He was not alone. Beside him, holding the reins, was a grim-faced man with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest. "Eleanor," Finch said, his voice as smooth and placid as a frozen lake. "This foolish game of yours is over. You've caused me a great deal of inconvenience." Samuel moved to stand in front of her, his body a solid wall between Eleanor and the man from her past. "You're not welcome here," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "This is my land. She's my wife." Finch let out a soft, condescending laugh. "Your wife? Did you see a preacher? File papers with a magistrate? No. What you have is a mail order arrangement. What I have," he produced a document from his inner coat pocket, "is a legally binding marriage certificate, signed and sealed in the state of Maryland. This woman is my wife, and she has absconded from her marital duties. Sheriff Miller is here to ensure she returns to them." The sheriff, a man with weary eyes, shifted uncomfortably but nodded. "It's the law. Croft, the paper is legal. She has to go with him." The world narrowed for Samuel. The law, the papers. The words meant nothing. All he saw was the source of Eleanor's pain, the architect of her nightmares. Standing on his land, intending to drag her back into hell, his hand drifted instinctively, slowly, toward the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. The movement was slight, but in the tense silence, it was as loud as a gunshot. "Don't," Eleanor whispered, her hand clamping down on his arm like a vice. Her fingers were ice cold. "Samuel, no." "He's not taking you," Samuel snarled. His eyes locked on Finch, his knuckles white where he gripped the handle of his gun. "Listen to her, farmer," Finch taunted, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Violence will solve nothing. It will only land you in a deeper hole than the one you already inhabit." "Samuel, look at me," Eleanor pleaded, her voice cracking. She tugged on his arm, forcing his gaze away from Finch and onto her. Her eyes were wide, filled not with fear for herself, but for him. "Think, if you draw that gun, if you shoot him, what happens then? They will hunt you down. They will put a rope around your neck and hang you from a tree for all the town to see." Her voice broke. "The whispers about you, about Sarah, they will say you were a killer all along. You will die. And for what? I will not be the cause of your death. I will not trade your life for my misery." Her words were a bucket of ice water, dousing the hot flames of his rage. She was right. He saw the cold, grim certainty in the sheriff's eyes. He saw the smug satisfaction on Finch's face. He was trapped. To fight was to die and prove his enemies right. To surrender was to lose everything. Her logic was a blade, and it cut him to the bone, leaving him bleeding and helpless. He slowly, agonizingly, let his hand fall away from his gun. The defeat was a physical weight, bowing his shoulders. Finch smiled, a victor's smile. "A wise decision. Pack your things. Eleanor, we leave at once." That night was a waking nightmare. Finch and the sheriff stayed, their presence a violation that poisoned the very air in the cabin. Eleanor moved like a phantom, packing her small bundle under Finch's watchful eye, her face a pale, emotionless mask. Samuel was forced to sit at his own table, a prisoner in his own home. while the man who had tormented the woman he loved drank his whiskey. The plan was to leave at first light. Finch, not wanting to risk a night journey, had decided to wait. Eleanor was given her old cot, while Finch took Samuel's bed. The sheriff slept in a chair by the door, a silent, weary guardian of a cruel law. Samuel was relegated to the floor, where he lay in the darkness, listening to Eleanor's muffled, silent weeping, a sound that tore him apart piece by piece. He must have drifted into an exhausted, fitful sleep just before dawn, because when he woke, the world was gray and the cabin was still. A strange, cold draft made him shiver. He sat up, his body aching, and saw that the cabin door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. A storm was brewing. The air was heavy and thick with the smell of rain. Panic seized him. He looked toward the bed. Finch was still asleep, snoring softly. The sheriff was slumped in his chair, but the cot was empty. Then he saw it, a single folded piece of paper on the rough wooden floor by the door, held in place by a small stone. A few drops of rain had already spattered across it, making the ink feather and bleed. His hands trembled as he picked it up. It was a page torn from her journal. The handwriting was hers, but it was shaky, blurred by tears and the encroaching rain. My dearest Samuel, forgive me. There is no other way. I cannot let you become a murderer for my sake. I cannot be the ghost who damns you. The life we had these past few weeks was more than I ever thought I deserved. Thank you for showing me what it feels like to be safe, to be loved. I will carry that with me, always. Do not follow me. Live. Be free. I love you. The words blurred before his eyes. He stumbled to the door and looked out. The rain was coming down now, a steady, chilling drizzle that turned the yard to mud. And there, already at the edge of his property, was the silhouette of Finch's buggy. A lone figure sat beside the driver. Eleanor. A guttural roar of pure anguish tore from his throat. He didn't stop to think, didn't grab a coat or a gun. He ran to the barn, his boots sinking in the mud, and threw a saddle onto his fastest horse with frantic, clumsy movements. He galloped out of the yard, the rain plastering his hair to his face, his heart pounding with a desperate, hopeless rhythm. He pushed the horse harder than he ever had before, flying across the open plain, the rain coming down in blinding sheets. The world dissolved into a gray, watery blur. He could barely see 20 feet ahead, but he kept the faint, dark shape of the buggy in his sights. He was gaining on them, the sound of his horse's hooves a frantic drumming against the storm. He could see her more clearly now. Her hair, having come loose from its pins, was a tangled, wet mess whipping in the wind. Her shoulders were slumped, her posture one of utter, solitary despair. She didn't look back. He opened his mouth to scream her name, but the word was stolen by a deafening clap of thunder that seemed to split the very sky. The heavens opened, and the drizzle turned into a torrential downpour. In an instant, his vision was completely obscured. He could see nothing but the churning, gray wall of rain. He wiped his eyes, urging his horse forward, but the buggy was gone, vanished, swallowed by the storm. He pulled his horse to a halt, the poor beast heaving beneath him. He spun in a circle, peering into the deluge, but there was nothing, only the vast, empty prairie being mercilessly beaten by the rain. The tracks of the buggy were already gone, turned into a soupy, indistinguishable mire. She was gone. "Eleanor!" he screamed, his voice raw, throwing his head back to the tempestuous sky. But the only answer was the roar of the wind and the relentless hammering of the rain. Another crash of thunder echoed his rage, his grief, his utter impotence. He was alone in the heart of the storm. The ride back was an eternity. The anger had drained away, leaving only a hollow, cavernous emptiness. He dismounted, letting the reins fall from his numb fingers. The cabin door was still open, an invitation to a life that no longer existed. He walked inside, dripping water onto the floor. and his eyes fell on the wedding dress. It was still hanging on a peg by the wall where she had left it, the worn lace a ghostly white in the gloom. Something inside him snapped with a cry that was more animal than human. He swept his arm across the mantelpiece, sending a tin cup and a stack of old letters crashing to the floor. He kicked over a chair, the wood splintering against the wall. He tore the curtains from the window and threw the whiskey bottle against the stone hearth, where it shattered, the amber liquid mixing with the rainwater on the floor. He was a storm himself, a force of pure, destructive grief, wrecking the small home they had just begun to build. Finally, his energy spent, he collapsed. He fell to his knees on the wet, debris-strewn floor, his body shaking with racking sobs. He crawled to the peg on the wall and pulled down her dress. It was damp from the humid air, the fabric cool against his feverish skin. He buried his face in it, inhaling the faint, lingering scent of her, of soap and herbs and hope. And there, amidst the wreckage of his home and his heart, Samuel Croft sat, clutching the empty dress of the bride he had watched ride alone into the rain, and knew, with a finality that crushed his soul, that he had lost her for good. Time, which had briefly become a sequence of sunrises and shared meals, dissolved into a thick, amber sludge at the bottom of a whiskey bottle. The days bled into one another, marked only by the slow crawl of a shadow across the cabin's filthy floor. Samuel lived like a ghost in the wreckage of his own life. The rage that had fueled him in the storm's immediate aftermath had burned out, leaving behind nothing but the cold, heavy ash of despair. He stopped working. The fences he and Eleanor had mended together sagged and broke, letting the cattle wander. The small herb garden she had so carefully planted withered, then was choked out by opportunistic weeds. Dust settled on every surface inside the cabin, a fine gray shroud over their brief happiness. He drank to forget the sight of her riding away into the rain. He drank to silence the echo of her voice in the empty rooms. He drank until the sharp edges of his grief were dulled into a constant, throbbing ache, but he never forgot. The memory of her was a hook in his soul, and the whiskey only ever pulled it deeper. On his infrequent trips to town for more liquor, he became a specter at whom whispers were directed. He'd stand at the bar in the saloon, his shoulders slumped, his face unshaven and gaunt, and pretend not to hear the murmurs. "There goes Croft," one would say. "Drank his first wife into the grave, and the second one ran off. Some men are just born to ruin. Heard she was a swindler," another would add, spitting tobacco juice near his boots. "Played him for a fool, took what she could, and vanished. Knew a fella once got a mail-order bride. Turned out she was wanted for theft in 3 counties. Others, like Martha from the neighboring homestead, would look at him with a pity that was somehow worse. "It's a curse," she'd whisper to the mercantile owner. "That land, that name." He tried to love again, and the world punished him for his greed. Samuel listened to it all, the words washing over him without purchase. Let them think what they wanted. Let them call him cursed or a fool. They hadn't seen the terror in her eyes. They hadn't felt her tremble in his arms. They didn't know the truth, and he was too broken to care. The change came nearly a season later, on a bitter day when the first hint of winter was in the wind. He was in the saloon, nursing a glass of whiskey, when a freight driver tossed a crumpled, month-old newspaper from St. Louis onto a nearby table. Samuel's eyes, dull and unfocused, drifted over the page, catching on a headline from the back pages. "Baltimore merchant in scandal. Finch accused of systematic marriage fraud." Samuel's breath caught in his chest. His hand trembled as he reached for the paper, the newsprint crackling in the quiet room. His eyes devoured the small block of text. The article detailed the arrest of one Alistair Finch, a man of supposed good standing, on charges of unlawful confinement and fraud. It spoke of a scheme in which Finch would use legal marriage contracts to entrap vulnerable women, effectively making them his prisoners under the guise of matrimony. The paper listed the names of several women freed from a secluded estate he owned outside the city. And there, near the end of the list, was her name. Eleanor Vance. A current of life, sharp and painful, shot through Samuel's veins, jolting him from his alcoholic stupor. She had been telling the truth, all of it. He hadn't been a fool. He'd been a witness to her courage. But the article held one final, chilling detail. While most of Mr. Finch's victims have been accounted for and returned to their families, one woman, Miss Vance, was not present at the estate. Authorities believe she may have escaped his custody weeks prior to the arrest. Her current whereabouts remain unknown. She was free. The thought was a sunrise inside him. She was no longer bound to that monster, but she was also gone, lost, alone in a world that had already shown her its ugliest side. The knowledge sobered him faster than a bucket of ice water. His grief, which had been a stagnant, bottomless pool, was suddenly channeled into a new, raging river. Purpose. He rode back to the ranch, the newspaper clutched in his hand. For the first time in months, he saw the decay not as a reflection of his soul, but as a chore to be undone. He spent the next 3 days in a fever of activity. He shaved, washed, and put on clean clothes. He sold half his herd to the first cattleman who would meet his price, taking far less than they were worth, needing the cash more than the equity. He packed a bag with jerky, a bedroll, and all the money he had. He took the small, worn daguerreotype of Eleanor he had found tucked into her journal, a picture of a solemn-faced girl who had not yet learned how cruel the world could be. His search began as a series of dead ends. He started where the trail had gone cold, following the stagecoach lines and the newly laid railroad tracks eastward. A salmon swimming against the current of manifest destiny. In every dusty station, every crowded train depot, every grimy town, he would ask the same questions, showing the same worn photograph. "Have you seen this woman? Fair hair, blue eyes? Goes by Eleanor." Most people just shook their heads, their faces impatient or indifferent. He was just another man looking for another lost soul in a country full of them. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The hope that had burned so brightly began to dim, but it never went out. He was sustained by a single, unshakable belief. She was alive, and she was free. He was in a boarding house in Omaha, a noisy, chaotic hub where a dozen westward trails converged and diverged. When he found his first real clue, he had nearly given up for the day, the faces of the travelers blurring into a single, anonymous mass. He showed the picture to the young serving girl clearing his table, a teenager with tired eyes named Clara. She stopped, a stack of dirty plates balanced on her arm, and squinted at the photograph. I think so," she said, her voice hesitant. "She was here, maybe a month back, only for a night." Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He leaned forward, trying to keep his voice calm. "Are you sure?" "Yes," the girl said, more certain now. "I remember her. She looked scared, kept watching the door like the devil himself was about to walk through it. She didn't have coin for the room, but she was a lady. You could tell. A real lady." "What happened to her? Where did she go?" he asked, his voice raw with urgency. Clara shook her head. "Don't know. She was gone before sunrise, but she left something. For payment. She told me she had to leave it behind, but it was the most important thing she owned. She made me promise to keep it safe." The girl disappeared into the back rooms and returned a moment later. She held out her hand. In her palm lay 2 small items. The first was a plain gold wedding band. Samuel stared at it, a symbol of the cage she had escaped. She had shed it like a snake sheds its skin. But it was the second item that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a small linen handkerchief, folded neatly. It was worn and soft from use, and in one corner, stitched with dark blue thread in a delicate, careful script, were 2 letters, intertwined. E+S. He reached out a trembling hand and took it. The fabric was so light, yet it felt as heavy as his own heart, This was not a token of payment. This was a message. This was a testament. In her moment of fear and flight, she had been thinking of him, of them. She had left behind the symbol of her bondage and held on to the symbol of their love. He knew then she was alive. She still loved him, and she was running not just from Finch, but for Samuel's sake, convinced she was a danger he could not afford. She didn't want him to be caught in the crossfire of her past. He gave the girl more money than she had likely seen in a month, his hands shaking as he tucked the handkerchief into his breast pocket, pressing it against his heart. His search was over. He would not find her by chasing her. She did not want to be found, because she was trying to protect him. The journey back to the ranch was different. He was no longer a man adrift, but a man with a mission. He rode with a new resolve, a quiet, unshakable certainty settling deep in his bones. When he finally crested the ridge and looked down upon his homestead, he saw the sagging fences, the weed-choked yard, and the lonely, dilapidated cabin not with despair, but with a builder's eye. He would not wander the earth looking for her. He would build a beacon. He would raise the fences, clear the weeds, and mend the roof. He would make the house a home again. He would restore everything, so that when she finally felt safe enough to stop running, she would have a place to return to, a home, waiting, a light in the window of a world that had been far too dark for far too long. Winter descended on the plains not as a gentle blanket of snow, but as an invading army. The wind turned sharp and cruel, carrying the bite of ice from the north. The ground, which had been cracked and thirsty, froze solid as iron. For the first time since Sarah's death, Samuel did not see the season as an enemy to be endured, but as a challenge to be met. His work became a form of prayer, a testament of faith against the encroaching despair. He lived a life of quiet, relentless industry. The whiskey bottles were gone, replaced by the scent of sawdust and sweat. He started with the barn, the place she had claimed as her own sanctuary. He replanked the stall where she had slept, reinforced the walls until they were impervious to the wind, and mended the great sliding door until it moved with a smooth, satisfying rumble. Every nail he hammered was a declaration. Every board he sawed was a promise. He was not just repairing a building. He was fortifying a bastion of hope. From the barn, he moved to the house. He fixed the porch step that had always groaned under his weight. He reglazed the window in her old room. He even took a spade to the frozen earth around the cabin, breaking the unforgiving soil to build a low stone wall around the patch of land where her herb garden had been. In the spring, he vowed, he would plant flowers there, daisies, maybe, or wild roses, something stubborn and beautiful that could survive the harshness of this land, something like her. One day, while returning from a trip to town, he found it huddled by the side of the road, a half-grown pup, all ribs and matted fur, shivering so violently it seemed its bones might shake apart. It looked up at him with eyes full of a misery he knew all too well. He should have kept riding. A dog was another mouth to feed, another drain on his meager resources. But in its profound and solitary wretchedness, he saw a reflection of himself. He dismounted, wrapped the trembling creature in his saddle blanket, and took it home. He cleaned the pup by the warmth of the stove, picking out burrs and tending to a small cut on its paw. It lapped up a bowl of watered-down milk with a frantic desperation that tightened his throat. That night, for the first time in months, the cabin did not feel so cavernously empty. The small, warm body curled up on a rag rug by the hearth was a living, breathing presence against the crushing silence. He needed a name for her. There was only one that came to mind, a name that was both a comfort and a constant, aching wound. "Ellie," he whispered into the quiet room. The dog's tail gave a single, tentative thump against the floorboards. It was settled. Ellie became his shadow, his constant companion. She followed him on his chores, sat at his feet while he ate, and lay her head on his lap in the long, dark evenings. Her unquestioning affection was a balm on his raw and wounded soul. She did not know his past, did not judge his sorrows. She simply was. Her presence softened him, chipping away at the hard, calloused shell he had built around his heart. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled like a banshee and the cabin timbers groaned in protest, he would sit by the fire, Ellie's warm weight against his leg, and take out the single, rain-blurred letter from his pocket. The ink was long gone, the words completely illegible, a ghostly smear on the fragile page. But he didn't need to see them. He had memorized them. He would hold the paper, feeling the faint crinkle of it between his fingers, and read it with his heart. My dearest Samuel, I cannot let you become a murderer for my sake. I love you. Each word was a brand, a sacred text he recited in the church of his memory. The hailstorm arrived without warning in the dead of February. It began as a strange drumming on the roof, which quickly escalated into a violent, percussive assault. He stood at the window, watching in awe as ice stones the size of robins' eggs hammered the frozen ground, shattering the stillness of the winter landscape. The noise was deafening, a roar that consumed the world. Ellie whined and pressed against his legs, terrified. And then he heard it, a sound distinct from the chaos of the storm. Thump, thump, thump. A knock at the door. His heart stopped. No one would be out in this. No sane person would be traveling. It had to be a traveler in dire straits, their wagon broken, seeking shelter from the storm's fury. But a wild, impossible hope surged through him, so powerful it made him dizzy. He unbolted the door and pulled it open. His body braced against the wind and the stinging ice. A furious gust tore into the cabin, sending papers flying and making the fire gutter wildly. He squinted into the swirling gray chaos. There was no one there. The porch was empty. The yard was a churning, white wasteland. Disappointment, swift and sharp, pierced him. He had been a fool. It was just the storm, a branch or a chunk of ice thrown against the wood. He was about to close the door when his eyes caught a small, dark shape on the wooden planks of the porch, half covered by the accumulating hail. He bent down, his fingers numb from the cold, and picked it up. It was a handkerchief, linen, and damp from the ice. It was not the one he carried in his pocket. This one was different. In the corner, stitched with the same neat, dark blue thread he remembered so vividly, was a single, embroidered word. Ellie. His blood ran cold. He stood up, his eyes scanning the maelstrom frantically. He looked down at the ground beyond the porch. There, protected for a moment by the overhang of the roof, were the unmistakable marks of a horse's hooves in the thin layer of ice and mud. They were fresh, and they were pointed away from the house. Someone had been here. Someone had ridden right up to his door, knocked, and then, for some reason, had turned and fled back into the storm. Eleanor. The name was a silent scream in his mind. She had come back. She had stood on his porch. She had been just feet away. But she had left. Why? Had she lost her nerve? Had she seen him through the window and thought he looked happy with the dog? That he had moved on? Had the violence of the storm seemed less terrifying than the prospect of facing him? He stumbled out onto the porch, heedless of the stinging hail, and stared out into the impenetrable gray wall of the storm. "Eleanor!" he roared, his voice swallowed by the tempest. He took a step, then another, as if to chase after her, but it was useless. She was gone, consumed by the same wildness that had taken her the first time. The strength went out of his legs, and he collapsed to his knees on the doorstep, the icy hail biting at his skin. He didn't know if the shuddering that racked his body was from the profound, bone-deep cold, or from the agony of a heart that had been offered a glimpse of heaven only to have it snatched away. He knelt there, clutching the small, embroidered handkerchief, until the storm passed and the world was once again silent and still. That night, sleep was a tormented, restless sea. He dreamed. He was in the cabin, and the air was warm, the hearth glowing. The door opened, and she walked in. Eleanor. She was wearing the old, worn wedding dress, the lace frayed but clean. She looked tired, her face thinner, her eyes holding the weight of 1,000 lonely miles. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked at him, not with fear, but with a deep, sorrowful uncertainty. "Samuel," she said, her voice the one he heard in his memory every night. "I saw the flowers you planted. I saw the dog." She took a small, hesitant breath. "I don't know if I can still be called your wife." He woke with a gasp, the dream so vivid, so real, that he expected to see her standing there. But the cabin was empty, save for the soft breathing of the dog at the foot of his bed. Her question from the dream echoed in the silent room. "I don't know if I can still be called your wife." It was then he understood. She was afraid. Afraid that too much time had passed, that the law and their strange beginning and her running away had invalidated whatever they had been to each other. She didn't know if she would be welcome. He rose from his bed. A new fire kindled in the embers of his despair. Patiently waiting was no longer enough. He needed to send a message. He needed to answer the question she was too afraid to ask in person. He sat at the table, pulled out a stack of fresh paper and a pen, and began to write. He wrote the same letter, over and over, his hand steady and his purpose clear. He wrote until his fingers cramped and the sun began to rise. When he was done, he had a dozen identical copies. He would ride to every town, every stagecoach stop, every post office within 100 miles. He would post his reply where any traveler might see it. He would cast his net of hope as wide as he possibly could. The message was simple, addressed to no one and everyone. It was the answer to the question in his dream, the promise he had been rebuilding his life upon. To Evie, it began, "Whatever you are, wherever you are, this house is still waiting for you." Another year bled into the land, healing the scars of the hailstorm and painting the plains with the fleeting greens of spring and the golds of autumn. Samuel's life settled into a rhythm of patient labor and unwavering hope. He worked not with the frantic energy of a man chasing a ghost, but with the steady, measured pace of a man building a lighthouse. The ranch thrived under his care. The new flowers he planted bloomed in a riot of defiant color, and Ellie grew from a scrawny pup into a sleek, devoted companion. But his heart remained in a state of quiet vigil. Every sunset, he would stand on his porch and look out at the vast, empty horizon, a silent question in his eyes. Christmas Eve arrived on a wave of biting cold. The air so still and clear it felt like glass. The town's small, clapboard church, which Samuel had not set foot in since before Sarah's death, was decorated with pine boughs and flickering candles. A sense of obligation he couldn't explain pulled him there. Perhaps it was a need to be among people, to feel a part of something larger than his own solitary waiting. Or perhaps it was just that on a night meant for family. His loneliness felt too vast for the small cabin to contain. He sat in a back pew, an outsider in a sea of familiar faces, feeling the warmth of the community as a distant, abstract concept. He listened to the off-key singing of carols, the drone of the preacher's sermon, the rustle of children in their Sunday best. Each scene of a family huddled together, a husband's arm around his wife, a mother shushing a fussy baby, was a small, sharp prick to his heart. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, a man out of time, waiting for a story to resume that the rest of the world had forgotten. As the service drew to a close and people began to murmur greetings, his eyes were drawn to a figure near the front, a woman, standing alone in the shadows by a pillar, her head and shoulders obscured by a thick woolen shawl. In her arms, she held a small, sleeping child, bundled tightly against the cold. There was something in her posture, a stillness, a deep-seated weariness, that resonated with his own solitude. He felt a pang of anonymous sympathy for this lone mother and her child on a night like this. He began to move toward the exit, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. When the woman shifted, she turned slightly to adjust the blanket around the child, and for a fleeting moment, the candlelight caught the line of her neck, the curve of her jaw. Samuel stopped dead. The air left his lungs. The cheerful noise of the church faded into a dull roar in his ears. It couldn't be. It was a trick of the light, a phantom created by a year of relentless longing. He took a hesitant step forward, his heart beginning to hammer a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. He had to be sure. He had to see her face. As if sensing his approach, she tensed. She pulled the shawl tighter, turning her back to him more deliberately, and began to move toward a small side door. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He couldn't lose her again. "Wait!" he called out, his voice a raw, broken thing that cut through the festive chatter. Heads turned. The woman froze, her back still to him, a statue of pure terror. She did not turn around, but the small child in her arms, woken by the sound, stirred. The bundle of blankets shifted, and a small head popped out, a thatch of dark, sleep-tousled hair. The boy looked around with wide, curious eyes. His gaze swept past the curious faces of the congregation and landed on Samuel. The world stopped. Time ceased to exist. The boy's face broke into a slow, sleepy, utterly beautiful smile. And in the sudden, profound silence of the church, a single, clear word floated through the air. "Pa!" A collective gasp went through the room. The woman's shoulders began to shake with violent, uncontrollable tremors. She slowly, agonizingly, turned around. It was Eleanor. Her face was thinner, etched with lines of hardship and fear he didn't recognize. But her eyes, those same deep blue eyes, now swimming with a torrent of tears, were the ones he saw every night in his dreams. She looked at him, her expression a shattering mixture of love, shame, and terror. She took a stumbling step backward, as if to run, her entire body trembling. Samuel didn't see the staring faces. He didn't hear the whispers that had begun to ripple through the pews. He saw only her and the small boy in her arms who had just called him father. He closed the distance between them, his legs unsteady, and sank to his knees on the cold floorboards. He knelt not before her, but before the child, his child. He looked up into the boy's face, his own dark hair, Eleanor's blue eyes, and a feeling so immense, so powerful that it was both joy and agony, broke over him. He reached out a trembling hand, not daring to touch, his gaze fixed on this small, miraculous proof of their love. Eleanor's composure finally shattered. A sob tore from her throat, and she leaned against the cold stone pillar for support, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. They found a small, unused vestry lit by a single candle, the sounds of the departing congregation muffled and distant. They sat on a wooden bench, the sleeping child now nestled in Samuel's arms, his small body a warm, solid weight against his chest. It was a reality so staggering he could barely comprehend it. In a low, halting voice, punctuated by tears, Eleanor told him everything. She spoke of her escape from Finch's buggy that first night, bribing the driver with the last of her money. She told him of the long, terrifying journey east, working menial jobs for a few coins, always looking over her shoulder, living under a series of false names. She described the profound loneliness of discovering she was with child, and the terror of giving birth in a charity boarding house in a nameless town, attended by a single, overworked midwife. "I named him Daniel," she whispered, her hand resting gently on the boy's head. "It means God is my judge. I felt so judged by everyone, by the world." She told him how she had made her way back west, slowly, carefully, drawn by an invisible thread she couldn't break. She had seen one of his letters, tacked to the wall in a post office 100 miles away. It had given her the courage to keep going. "I came back once," she confessed, her eyes fixed on the flickering candle flame. "Last winter, there was a hailstorm. I got to the door, but I lost my nerve. I saw you through the window. You had the dog. You looked peaceful. I thought maybe you had healed, that my showing up would only tear open the old wounds. I convinced myself that leaving was the kindest thing I could do. For you." "Why now, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why come back now?" She finally met his gaze, her own eyes raw and pleading. "Because I couldn't bear it another day. Because Daniel started asking questions I couldn't answer. Because he deserves to know his father." Her voice broke. "And because I missed you so much I thought my heart would stop beating. I was so afraid. I still am. I didn't know if you would even want to see me." Samuel looked down at the child sleeping in his arms, his son, and then back at the woman who had endured hell to bring him into the world and keep him safe. He had no words for the storm of emotions inside him, the fierce, protective love for this boy, the profound, aching sorrow for all the moments he had missed, and the overwhelming, all-consuming love for her. A love that had not only survived, but had grown stronger in the desolate winter of their separation. He said nothing. Instead, he simply shifted the sleeping child in one arm and wrapped the other around her, pulling her tightly against him. He held them both, his family, and shook with the force of a year's worth of pain and longing finally being released. He was no longer a man waiting. He was a man who had found what he was waiting for. The ride back to the cabin was silent, a stark contrast to her last journey from this place. The world was blanketed in a fresh layer of snow, pristine and quiet under the light of 1,000,000 stars. When they arrived, he carried Daniel inside, while Eleanor followed, her steps hesitant, as if crossing the threshold into a dream she was afraid would vanish. He had left a lamp burning low. The cabin was warm and clean. The fire in the hearth was banked, its embers glowing softly. It was a place of peace, a sanctuary that had been waiting for its occupants to return. Eleanor's gaze swept over the room, taking in the small changes, the mended chair, the smooth, plain table, the small shelf of books he'd acquired. And then she saw it. On the mantelpiece, exactly where it had been the day she left, was the small, framed picture they had taken on their wedding day. It was covered in a fine layer of dust, an object untouched by time, a testament to a moment he had refused to erase. It was a silent, powerful declaration that for him, nothing had ever ended. She walked to the hearth and gently picked it up, her fingers tracing the outline of his face, then her own, the tears she had held back for so long. Tears of grief and fear and loneliness finally gave way to tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking relief. She was home. The news of Eleanor's return spread through the high plains faster than a prairie fire. It was a delicious scandal, served up just in time for the long, isolating winter. The town, which had feasted on the tragedy of Samuel Croft for years, now had a fresh, complex course to devour. In the mercantile and the saloon, the story was told and retold, each telling adding a new layer of speculation and moral judgment. She comes back with a babe in arms. Mind you, one woman would cluck to another over a barrel of flour. No wedding ring, no explanation. And he just takes her in? The man's a fool, bewitched by a pretty face. That child could be anyone's. "It's a judgment," a grizzled farmer would pronounce, his voice heavy with sanctimony. "First, he loses his good wife, Sarah, in that terrible accident. Now he takes up with a runaway of questionable virtue. The Lord is marking him for his sins. Plain and simple." The whispers followed Samuel like his own shadow whenever he rode into town for supplies. He would feel the weight of staring eyes, hear the sudden halt of conversations as he passed. In the past, this silent condemnation had been a poison he'd willingly drunk, a penance for a guilt he couldn't name. He had allowed their suspicions to build the walls of his prison. But this time was different. He was no longer a man living for the dead. He was a man fighting for the living. He had a son whose laughter filled the corners of the cabin that had once echoed with sorrow. He had a woman whose quiet strength had rebuilt him from the ground up. He would not allow the town's venom to touch them. One Saturday, He hitched the wagon, dressed himself and Daniel in their cleanest clothes, and helped Eleanor onto the seat beside him. Her hands were trembling, her face pale. "We don't have to do this, Samuel," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the town in the distance. "Yes," he said, his voice calm and steady as he took her hand in his. "We do." He drove them not to the mercantile, but to the church, where the Sunday service had just let out. He pulled the wagon to a stop right in the center of the dispersing congregation, forcing them to part around the wagon like a river around a stone. The whispers started immediately, a low, buzzing hum. Samuel stood up in the wagon bed, a commanding figure against the pale winter sky. Daniel sat on the seat, clutching Eleanor's hand, his wide blue eyes taking in the crowd. Samuel's gaze swept over them all, meeting the eyes of the gossips, the doubters, and the self-righteous. He waited until a tense silence had fallen. "I know what you've all been saying," he began, his voice clear and strong, carrying in the cold air. "You've been talking about this woman. You've been speculating about this child." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Well, I'm here to tell you the truth, so you don't have to waste your breath on lies anymore." He looked down at Eleanor, his expression softening into one of fierce, protective love. "This is Eleanor, and in the eyes of God, she has been my wife since the day she first showed me kindness in my own home. This is my son, Daniel." He said the words, "my son," with a force that dared anyone to challenge him. "There will be a wedding," he announced, his gaze returning to the stunned crowd. "Next Sunday, at sunset, on my land. The preacher can come if he's willing. You all can come if you are willing to stand as friends. But if you intend to come as judges, then stay away. My family's happiness is no longer a subject for public debate." He sat back down, took up the reins, and with a soft click of his tongue, drove the wagon through the parted, silent crowd. He didn't look back. The wedding was as stark and beautiful as the land itself. There was no church, only the vast, open prairie. The sky a cathedral of blazing orange and deep purple as the sun began to sink below the horizon. The traveling preacher, a kind man with gentle eyes, had agreed to come. A few neighbors, including Martha, stood as witnesses, their faces reflecting a quiet respect for Samuel's stand. Eleanor wore her old wedding dress. She had spent the week mending it, her needle and thread moving with meticulous care. She had patched the small tears, reinforced the delicate lace, and washed it until it was a soft, creamy white. The dress, once a symbol of a life she'd fled and a transaction she'd been forced into, was transformed. It was now a testament to survival, a patchwork of her past and present, mended and made whole, just like her spirit. As she walked toward Samuel across the dry grass, with little Daniel holding her hand and Ellie, the dog, trotting happily alongside them, she was not a mail-order bride or a runaway. She was a woman walking toward her home, her future, her love. They stood before the preacher, the wind tugging at their clothes, and exchanged vows that were not from any book. They were promises forged in loneliness and fear, tempered by hope and forgiveness. He promised to be her shield, her harbor, her home. She promised to be his comfort, his joy, his peace. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Samuel lifted her veil, a piece of lace she had found and sewn on herself, and kissed her, not with the desperate hunger of their first kiss, but with the deep, certain tenderness of a man who knew he was finally, irrevocably, home. That night, the cabin was an island of warmth and light in the vast, dark prairie. Daniel was asleep in the small cot Samuel had built for him, his breathing soft and even. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. Eleanor and Samuel came together not to erase the past, but to embrace the present. Their love-making was a silent conversation, a language of touch that spoke of all the things for which words were too small. It was a rediscovery of a landscape they had only briefly explored, now navigated with the confidence of belonging. His hands on her skin were not just passionate, but reverent, mapping the journey she had taken back to him. Her touch was not just accepting, but fierce, claiming the man who had waited for her, who had rebuilt his world in an act of faith. It was an act of profound and boundless forgiveness, forgiving the world for its cruelty, forgiving each other for their fears, and forgiving themselves for being merely human. There were no ghosts in the room, only the intense, breathtaking, and sacred reality of the here and now. Later, as they lay tangled in the sheets, the fire burning down to glowing embers, they didn't need to speak of love. It was in the air they breathed, in the steady, synchronized rhythm of their hearts. It was in the way he brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, in the way she traced the line of his jaw with her fingertip. No words were sufficient, and none were necessary. As if on cue, they heard a soft patter on the roof, a sound that had once been the soundtrack to his deepest despair. The rain began to fall, a gentle, steady drumming on the tin. In the past, that sound had mocked his solitude. It had been the sound of her absence. Eleanor tensed slightly, a ghost of a memory passing through her. But Samuel only smiled. He gathered her closer, his arm a solid, protective weight around her. He reached out his other hand and laid it gently on the sleeping head of his son. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He kissed the top of her head. "Let it rain." He held them both, his wife and his child, a complete and perfect circle in his arms. The storm could rage outside, the world could whisper and judge. But in here, they were safe. No one was riding away alone into the rain ever again. And in the distant, muffled rumble of thunder, the two fractured halves of a single heart, once broken and scattered by a cruel world, finally found their shelter, their solace, their home. Thank you for listening to our story around the Wild West Campfire. We'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales from the old frontier. And please share your thoughts on Eleanor and Samuel's journey.